I will be introducing everyone to our amazing chairperson of the day, as well as our panel moderator later this afternoon. Dr. Mark is a commercial research scientist with more than 30 years of experience in the discovery of novel treatments for diseases with unmet medical needs. Formerly at Pfizer, he was responsible for research into neurodegenerative diseases in the UK. He set up Cambridge Drug Discovery as chief executive in 1997, which was sold to Biofocus plc. Since then, he's helped multiple life science companies raise money for R&D research. He serves on the boards of multiple therapeutics and diagnostic companies worldwide, works with teams to out-license therapeutic assets over the last 20 years for a variety of milestones. Without any further ado, Dr. Mark.
Thank you very much, Sam. That's very helpful. I'm going to try and now share my screen, so you can let me know whether I've been successful or not. Bear with me. Let me have a go. Yeah, so we should be able to share. Right. Are we seeing? Can we see a PowerPoint now?
Yeah, we see your first slide.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. So I will. If I can get that up as a slideshow. Bear with me. Oh, there we are. Good. So I'm here with my Monument Therapeutics hat on today to talk about a company which is a relatively new company that we've just raised funding for. And we've been very much focused on bringing, what we call precision medicine to neuroscience drug development, to try and make that drug development process more efficient, more focused, and basically get the right drug in the right patient at the right time. And today's talk very much is around trying to answer the question, can digital biomarkers transform drug development pathways for treating neuroinflammation in the post-COVID era? So we're looking at this in two different ways. One is to say, can actually we use digital biomarkers or digital tools to make the process, more efficient, and that's generically across many different approaches. But also specifically, we have our own therapeutic program that is targeting neuroinflammation. So we thought that would be the best one to use as a case study, because if we can dampen neuroinflammation down for people who sadly are suffering from long COVID or even acute COVID symptoms, we think that could be a therapeutic benefit. Although I mentioned sort of Monument is relatively new and we raised money earlier this year, it's actually a spin out of Cambridge Cognition. So it's the company you heard about earlier that's been developing sort of tools out of Cambridge University for a number of years, in fact, number of decades. And unlike Cambridge Cognition, we're focused on our own therapeutic products. We develop our own therapeutic products and we take those forward with investment, but we have a license to some aspects of Cambridge Cognition's technology. So we use some of their technology and we're developing it for our own internal pipeline. So basically, this is our sort of thesis here, is that a stratified approach to neuroscience drug development is a good thing. That actually, you can waste a lot of time and money and actually, even risk, patients' health by putting the wrong drug in the wrong patient at the wrong time. And in our view, most CNS drugs fail because the diagnostic criteria do not reflect the biological activity. So what we're trying to do is to reconnect the biology that we know, and that could be genetics, it could be imaging, it could be cognition, it could be many different things, it could be pharmacology. We're trying to connect that to diagnostic criteria that are meaningful to enable the clinical trial, hopefully get the drug to registration or approval, and then help with post-market surveillance and monitoring going forward. So what we use is digital biomarkers. These are originally derived from Cambridge Cognition, and they use letters, but they don't actually use words. So it's a way of looking at different gamification to some extent of the process. And what this enables us to do is to use people to be classified according to their phenotype. So we might be interested in the people with green legs. We're not so interested in people with red legs and blue legs. And so we separate them out, and we just select a patient cohort who is the one we think is more likely to respond to the drug or the drug system. So if we pair them together and not treat them as separate, we can actually then link the biological mechanism to the mechanism of action of the drug. So this enables us hopefully to translate, preclinical research or even existing clinical research and translate that into a new drug paradigm. And so our strategy is to work mostly with existing drugs rather than develop new drugs. Well, there's plenty of drugs either on the shelf or available that we're developing. So we have one program on schizophrenia, which is looking at a fixed dose combination. So we're bringing two existing drugs together, combining them and developing that. And we believe that will reduce the side effect profile, improve the side effect profile of that particular combination of drugs. But also, and this is what we're going to talk about today, is look at anti-neuroinflammatories. And we believe anti-inflammation drugs have potential widely across many different indications, including Alzheimer's disease, post-operative cognitive decline, and also in long COVID that we'll talk a little bit about today. So taking those things, we can take a digital biomarker and actually develop what we call a drug and diagnostic combination. And this is useful to, we believe, enable and make the development more rapid and more effective, and actually, not waste time and money, and potentially risk issues in some patients who are not most suited to taking that particular drug. Digital biomarkers are, in our view, rapid and scalable, and they're non-invasive computerized tests. So this is different from having to use, for example, MRI technology, obviously great technology developed over many years, but you have to go into a hospital to do that. And so in a pandemic, people are prioritizing other things in hospitals rather than doing clinical trials. The nice thing that, as you heard earlier from Cambridge Cognition, these tests can be run on many different types of mobile devices, from iPhones, laptops, watches, and so on. So they're things that people already have in the home, or things that you can introduce to the home, or a non-clinical setting or a partial clinical setting, which actually makes the whole process easier. And then use a combination of artificial intelligence and machine learning to go through the use of large pre-existing data sets. So we've in-licensed quite a lot of data, and we've used that in-licensed data to help predict, or try and predict, what is the best course for designing the clinical trials. And so this is enabling a new precision medicine approach to neuroscience drug development and patient treatment. And so what we're trying to do is maximize the success for approval, overcome trial and error prescribing, where you prescribe the drug based on a heterogeneous cohort and hope for the best, and then ultimately move forward to value-based pricing and reimbursement, because ultimately it's payers who will want to pay for a drug that is producing better outcomes, or a drug combination or therapy that's producing better outcomes, than to pay for something that might work. And so again, we would have the data to take it all the way from through phase 1 into phase 2, 3, 4, phase 4 post-market surveillance, and then on to developing reimbursement strategies, which we think would be particularly useful going forward. Now to talk about neuroinflammation and drug development. And many years ago, people really believed in neuroinflammation at all. When I was a student, people used to think the brain was an immunoprivileged organ. The blood-brain barrier kept out things like antibodies, and that really it was very different. And it was very different and is very different in terms of how it responds to neuroinflammation. But we now know that the microglia, for example, the resident inflammatory cells of the brain, become activated very rapidly. And although they have many characteristics that are similar to peripherally acting macrophages, they respond differently. We also know that astrocytes these days, other types of glial cells, respond to inflammation differently, and actually a key part of the neuroinflammatory effect. And the other point, I think, is that neurons tend to be very old cells. They're often as old as we are. They don't turn over. So their sensitivity to inflammation is different and differs from other cells of the body. And actually, neurons can be very long. A peripheral nerve can maybe be a meter long in a tall person. So not only do the neurons behave differently, but the inflammatory process is different. And so I think we need to adopt a different approach, or an analogous approach, I should say, when we're treating neuroinflammation in the brain. Probably the biggest condition in which neuroinflammation is known to play a significant role is Alzheimer's disease. Some argue it's actually a fundamental process of aging and a fundamental process of the body's response to aging. Others argue it's not, but everyone agrees that actually if you have inappropriate inflammation, either centrally in the brain or peripherally, and you then get cytokines crossing the blood-brain barrier and can exacerbate the disease. But clearly Alzheimer's is a very sort of heterogeneous group. You have familial patients who have a very strong, monogenetic component, and you have other patients, which many of us, potentially would suffer from, have a much more heterogeneous form of disease. The other thing is traumatic brain injury. We're seeing increasingly for people playing sport that, for example, people who head footballs or play certain types of boxing, for example, traumatic brain injury. It seems very important that inappropriate inflammation can actually lead to not only short-term consequences, but long-term consequences. And there's further evidence in stroke and depression as well, that particularly in stroke, that you get an inappropriate inflammatory response, which can then lead to not just the area that suffered ischemia, but the areas of the brain that then have a wave of excitation. And inappropriate inflammation can, in fact, exacerbate this considerably. Many big pharma companies, for example, Janssen, J&J, Pfizer, and Lundbeck, and others have tried to repurpose standard anti-inflammatories for indications. And our view is we're trying to do the same, but actually not make the same mistakes. So I guess the question is, why do we think that big pharmaceutical companies have failed? And many of the standard inflammatories were found to be formulated for minimal blood-brain barrier penetration. In fact, in some of the molecules, this was actually designed into them by the medicinal chemists because they didn't want to penetrate the brain. And although you could argue that they're treating systemic or inflammation outside the brain and could actually dampen the access of inflammatory cytokines to cross the blood-brain barrier, our argument is you want anti-inflammatories to enter the brain and actually be there in higher concentrations if it can possibly be achieved, than having them acting just purely systemically or purely peripherally. So at Monument Therapeutics, we've licensed a well-tolerated anti-inflammatory compound, which we've used some clever technology with one of our partners to reformulate for enhanced brain uptake. So we get considerably higher levels in the brain than this drug achieves normally. And although this drug we believe to be safe peripherally, we have to do some testing to show that with the higher concentrations in the brain, that this will actually, in our view, potentially produce better clinical outcomes in the patients in which we want to test it. We think this has enormous market potential. And Alzheimer's market is about 20 billion per annum. And clearly, in our view, that will possibly be exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. The depression market, where some hypothesize that neuroinflammation is also involved, will be about 19 billion by 2026. And the stroke market is still relatively underserved at greater than 25 billion. And although there's been significant traction with clot busting drugs in terms of to help people who are having dry strokes or breaking clots up to improve. In wet strokes and other forms of neuroinflammation, there are relatively few drugs out there, and so there's another unmet medical need. And the global traumatic brain injury therapeutics market is likely to grow significantly by 550 million over the next few years. So our view is all of those are difficult things to do, and could we actually get clinical proof of concept in an easier cohort of patients? And so our first indication is post-operative cognitive decline, or POCD. So these are people who go into hospital for routine surgery elective surgery, I should say. And people often see a cognitive decline following the surgery, and that's whether it's peripheral or central, and quickly demonstrating neuroprotective effects with an anti-inflammatory drug. So the timing is easier to control because people book into the hospital clinic to have their surgery. It's easy to do, and then each patient can act as their own control, where that's much harder to do in a chronic degenerative disease such as Alzheimer's disease, and in some ways even harder to do in a very acute degenerative disease like stroke, where you have to get the patient admitted and assessed within, some say an hour and some say 4 hours. We would then go from there and enhance, assuming we get positive proof of concept in post-operative cognitive decline. We would move into Alzheimer's disease and other indications where we think neuroinflammation is important. And there's increasing evidence that post-viral cognitive impairment or long COVID is an increasing market. And if you look at the MRI scans in some of these patients, it looks like they're having mini strokes. So clearly, and thankfully not in everyone, but we do think that this is a potential response to long COVID, which is probably not going to go away in the short term, despite the successes with the various vaccination approaches. So just to talk a little bit more about COVID, because we think that's a particularly interesting area in terms of this conference and more generally across society globally. So what are the potential pathogenic mechanisms that may account for the detrimental effect of COVID-19 on the CNS? So there's a real potential of direct viral encephalitis. So this is where the virus actually enters the brain itself. And many of us who've worked on Alzheimer's over many years, every virus that's been out there has in some way been implicated in being a latent virus that triggers dementia. So this is not a new idea, but it's a new virus that is obviously going to be very prevalent and being assessed. So we do think that there could well be, for some patients, sadly, a direct viral effect of encephalitis. I think more acutely, you're seeing systemic inflammation. Some people are going through cytokine storms, and these cytokine storms will almost certainly affect all organs, but including the brain, because some cytokines are very CNS penetrant, and also other peripheral organ dysfunction. And the attraction of having a new drug that acts systemically and centrally means that you could treat that. Ideally, we are going to focus on the brain, but obviously if you pick up some peripheral benefits at the same time and someone is having a cytokine storm, you can take one drug rather than two. And the other thing that we know from a lot of stroke studies is that there is inflammation, and the inflammation changes cerebrovascular blood flow. And this can be negative and it can be positive. So we think there are a number of scientific angles that are relevant to SARS-CoV-2. So these particles spread through the respiratory mucosa. As we all know, it's a sort of respiratory virus, infects other cells, causing changes in the peripheral immune cells and enlisting a sort of an immune response and the cytokine storm that we referred to. And these studies, and we can send some papers, and this example is down the bottom of this slide here, imply that inflammation activation is inextricably linked to cognitive dysfunction. So the cytokine storm syndrome puts COVID-19 survivors at risk of developing long-term neurological consequences, potentially aggravating or accelerating existing neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's disease, or potentially by initiating patients who would have died from some other cause, but are now actually going to be at a higher risk of a COVID-related cognitive deficit over a prolonged period of time. Many cytokine profiles are associated with COVID-19, and in particular the rise of interleukin-1 beta and interleukin-18. These are very well-known pro-inflammatory cytokines in the brain. It seems likely that COVID-19 patients are suffering from inflammasome activation. So 1/3 of patients at the time of discharge, we're told, demonstrate cognitive impairments and motor deficits. So that's 1/3 of COVID patients. Now, that may be acute, or that may potentially be chronic. I imagine for the majority of patients, thankfully, it's relatively acute, but it does actually store up risk for more chronic conditions, which could potentially cause longer term consequences. So I think this is the rationale and identification for hyperinflammation to improve cognitive outcome, and we think it's a sort of very timely approach as we enter the clinic with our new potential new therapy. So how do we actually going to treat this? So we can see the cytokine storm here that we've mentioned and the cognitive impairments. We have developed a digital diagnostic which assesses whether the parents meet the current criteria for minor neurocognitive impairment. So we would argue that these patients are at higher risk. If they already have some underlying cognitive impairment, then the surgery, whatever surgery that may be, is probably more likely, in our view, to have an enhance that or have a cognitive effect, partially perhaps because their cognitive reserve has been reduced. Also, I think a history of viral infection. For example, if people have had viruses before and this has triggered a cognitive effect, we think this is quite likely to be another risk factor. And so we've reformulated a generic anti-inflammatory, which is on the market in certain parts of the world, and significantly enhanced blood-brain barrier penetration of this compound by using a sort of lipid formulation. We used a specialist partner to do this. And the preclinical work is now ready to go with that, or working on that compound to take it into the clinic and start those clinical trials in post-operative cognitive decline that we referred to earlier. So I think there's an immediate unmet clinical need in the proportion of the 15 million plus COVID cases there are now. Maybe up to a third of those could benefit from this type of drug, and also a longer term neuroprotection for healthy aging and the prevention, or at least the slowing of Alzheimer's disease progression. So that's a sort of summary of where we are and where we're going at Monument Therapeutics. Clearly, it's early days for us in the sense that we've just sort of funded the company and we're starting the trials, but we think we'll hope to get there fast by using existing drugs, existing therapeutic approaches, but reformulating from the CNS. And in parallel to these programs at Monument Therapeutics, we also have a strong interest in developing a parallel program for the treatment of schizophrenia that we spoke about earlier. And also we have an emerging interest in the use of new sort of psychedelic therapies. This is new sort of serotonin modulators that seem to have got around some of the historic problems with that type of molecule. So we have a portfolio approach based on cognitive biomarkers, but one of our key programs that we discussed today is based on an anti-neuroinflammatory approach. If you'd like to discuss that with you, I've got my email there. That's mtreherne, Treherne at monumenttx.com. Do feel free to email me. And I'm just I can't see the clock on my thing, but we hopefully got about 5 or maybe a bit longer for questions. So I'm going to tempt fate here and stop sharing, and hopefully people ask me some questions, because I can't ask myself questions. Well, I could, I suppose, but it's